Vinny.
So I score top 25.
I don't know how to do a tasting without a placemat.
Oh, well, I had to ask Charles this afternoon for one. So a special.
Okay, guys.
Okay.
All right, we're gonna get started. Everybody online, can you hear me okay? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. All right.
Okay, yeah, so the first one.
I'll find it now, wait.
All right, so welcome, everybody. I know this is the first time for most of you in the tasting room, whatever you want to call it, our kind of remote office. It's really a nice little spot back here the way overlooking Viola Street, but tasting number 126 of the Saratoga Whiskey Club. So we started back in 2015 and have really just taken off, ramped up, especially during the pandemic. We added a lot of new members who were stuck at home, and we were dropping off drams at people's doorsteps and socializing that way. It was a lot of fun. We learned a lot during those couple of years. It was a horrible time, but it was a great time as well for whiskey. But yeah, tonight, Holly and I are going to do a kind of intro to whiskey class. We have a lot of new people in the club. There's some new people online. We are recording this. There's some people who are going to watch it later as well. But this is kind of how we do things with the club. We pick different styles of tastings, you know, focus on either certain brands or doing what we're doing tonight, which is kind of a overall encompassing learning evening. Some are, you know, basic tasting. Some get pretty elevated and pretty special with bottles that we bring from Scotland or Japan or all over the world. But so tonight we're going to kind of go over the basics of whiskey. And, you know, when we do these tastings, both Holly and I have a very different style. It's kind of complementary, but it's different. And that's kind of how we run the shop too. We both have our own style of working in the shop, and it's really fun to work together. But typically myself, when I do a kind of I would call this an around the world tasting, because we're covering, you know, different countries. I usually start with American whiskey and then move to Irish or Japanese and then finish with Scotch. But I think we talked about it, and with this tasting, with the bottles that we picked, it was much better to kind of start with Scotch because it is also a little bit lower in proof tonight, and then we kind of end with a little bit of American punch. But yeah, so we're going to do 3 Scotches tonight, an Irish single grain whiskey and 2 American whiskeys, 1 bourbon and 1 rye. But we'll kind of go through all of these as we go through it, explain a little bit how whiskey is made, what makes whiskey different from different countries, how they all work together as well to produce whiskeys all over the world, how much they depend on each other, all of these different things that most people, you know, don't really understand when they're drinking it. But we're going to start with Scotland tonight, and there are just 3 ingredients to whiskey. It's all it is 3 ingredients. Water. Whiskey is called the water of life, so water is a very crucial, important part of making whiskey. Most distilleries are located near a water source, but it's not required. There are distilleries that are in cities that use city water. Again, it's not required, but you will find most of these distilleries being close to some body of water, usually a stream or a freshwater source. But the other ingredient is yeast, which we'll talk a little bit about during the whiskey making process, and grain. Grain is the crucial element that really makes all of these whiskeys different. With Scotland, they use different grains, but with these first couple of whiskeys that we're tasting tonight, this is a blended malt. Yeah. So these are all going to be barley. that we're starting with. So the first three whiskeys are all 100% barley, which is one of the key grains for Scotland. They do use other grains as well. They use corn and wheat, but barley is what's most commonly known for single malts. That's one of the rules for making a single malt Scotch, is it has to be 100% malted barley. So barley is a very key important grain for Scotland.
So start drinking this one.
Yeah, so we're going to start with the
Glenlossie. So you're particular.
yep, bottom left.
left. See, I typically.
And Rich,
do
I
top
will
left.
email you a place back. I'm sorry. I made them late today, so I didn't get them out.
Yeah, so we're gonna.
Thanks, Charles.
And I like to start with Scotch too, because I think it's the easiest to understand. It can be a little bit intimidating from a flavor profile, but it's all, from one distillery, one type of grain, one country. So it's very linear in a way.
But it
So-
can be blended over years, right?
Yes, and this is, I also wanted to note too, that this is a great opportunity. We want questions. And I know some folks that are on the Zoom call right now have been on some of my other classes. And I actually really like to be interrupted, or else I just feel like I'm talking to myself. And I talk to myself all the time about whiskey in my head, or to Eric or Charles. So please interrupt with anything that pops in your head, because it actually will take us to more interesting topics in general that we maybe forget about in our whiskey bubble too, and makes us think a little bit harder about things. But single malt to me is the simplest, because it's telling you it's from one single distillery. That's the single in the single malt. So not a single cask. It's not just one single cask of whiskey. It's from one single distillery, and it's made out of 100% malted barley. So you're like, all right, got it. There's only one grain, it's one distillery, and it's from one country. Because if you put the word Scotch on a bottle, it has to come from Scotland. So it already drives you to a very understandable situation where we get into American whiskey a lot of times, and some styles of Scotch, like Charles had mentioned. American whiskey, you start talking about mash bills and all of these different recipes and sourcing, and we don't always necessarily know where the whiskey came from. And so American whiskey can be a little bit, although a little bit sweeter, so a lot of people start with it, it also can be a little bit not as easy to trace to exactly where it came from, and not in a bad way. It's just Scotch. You can say, okay, this is a marriage of, this actually is a single cask. So there is only a couple hundred bottles of this release. So this is an anomaly, but that's what we do at the shop, is we like really special things. So this is one single cask. It'll have the bottle count, 248 bottles. So this is an exclusive release. But typically, if you look at a Macallan bottle, yeah.
You guys, I'm so happy. I Googled it, and first fill is the
Came
first,
up.
is the first result.
That's how special the bottle is. So
What
it's,
does Glenlossie mean?
so Glenlossie is actually the distillery. So we talked a little bit about, this is why Whiskey 101, this is actually Whiskey 201, because we're going to be talking about some things that are a little on the outskirts of mainstream brands. So Macallan, Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, some of Belvany, some of these bigger brands, those are called distillery releases. So the distillery itself produced it, and then they released their own expression of their whiskey. This is actually from an independent bottler. So you'll see the first name is Old Particular, Douglas Laing's Old Particular. So that is actually who bottled this whiskey. It's an older family company from the early 1900s, and they buy whiskey from other distilleries and then mature it how they want and release single casks, and as we'll see, small batch releases of those whiskeys. So this is a distillery, Glenlossie. You've never heard of it because it is a great distillery in Scotland, but they never release their own whiskey, like Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, Macallan. Actually, about 80% of distilleries in Scotland still to this day do not release their own whiskey. So you're kind of missing out if you don't start to branch out, either A, go to Scotland and try and visit them and taste them there, or in these old family companies called independent bottlers, you can actually try distilleries and whiskeys that you would never get to try normally because they're not bottling. There's no brand. There's no other way to try it. So Glenlossie is from the Speyside region. So it's actually not far from those big distilleries that we listed. And that northern region of Scotland is known to be unpeated whiskeys. So it doesn't have that campfire smoke attack on the nose and on the palate of the whiskey. Known to be fruitier, citrus, malty. Yeah.
So I'm generally more of a wine drinker. Is there like a certain way you're supposed to taste whiskey?
Yeah,
and
that's a
stuff,
great
or-
question.
Hey, Holly,
Yeah.
if they ask questions, let's make sure we
Repeat.
repeat it. Yeah.
So the
Everybody.
question is how to, well, the first comment was that when you search Glenlossie, First Fill Spirits comes up. So that's an A+ for
Yay.
First Fill. But the next question is how to drink the whiskey. It's similar to wine. We just don't have to necessarily try as hard because the aroma will come to you. So you don't have to really dive too deep into the glass. These legally to be whiskey, you have to be bottled over 40% alcohol by volume. So wine is 10 to, I guess, 18, 10 to 15 sort of range. This is going to be, sort of leap out of the glass at you, but you're going to have the same concept where you just sort of go back and forth between each nostril. Keep your mouth open too, if you can. Your nose and your palate are connected. You smell and you taste food. They're all intertwined. And then it's always super, super small sips, especially if it's your first whiskey of the day. It's gonna wake you up a little bit. It should rush your senses, right?
Pleasantly warm, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
everything starts to warm up. There's some tingling going on. Yes, some coughing sometimes too. That's why we have plenty of water in the back as well.
What's
But
the ABV on this?
this is 48.4% ABV.
It tastes stronger than that, but maybe that's just because it's the first one.
What was the ABV?
Not just distinct. no.
So if it doesn't sit on
This
your
is-
tongue for a long time, it tends to be lower in ABV, right?
Although I tell you, it sticks to the glass a lot. It's got
Yeah, everyone's
some warm
palate's
bite.
gonna be a little bit different, how it sits. And I would recommend leaving a little bit of every whiskey that we have tonight and actually going back and revisiting it. You try things side by side. So even right now, if you want to take the second one, and because it's still in Scotland, yeah, it's a different type of maturation, so we can ease into that. Yeah, it's gonna be your middle
That sounds
bottom.
Totally.
So same region of Scotland, same sort of concept, same barley, not from Glenlossie, but go back and forth and you'll see that you can't lump Scotch, bourbon all together. You just have to keep trying them all. Yay, yes, you have to. So for tasting, very, very small sips, where you basically can roll it around your mouth very slowly, coat your mouth, actually open your mouth too, if you can, let some of that alcohol evaporate off of your palate. And on that second and third sip is when you're gonna start to get these flavors that people are talking about on the bottle. They start listing things, marzipan, melted chocolate, and you're like, what the heck? Like, I taste
Yeah.
alcohol. I have, it's really gonna take that second, third sip. Whiskey is a very slow process. And yeah, it's chewing it, it's, keeping your mouth open, letting things evaporate, letting some of that air get to it. And a question that does always come up, and there's some water droppers on the table, and especially with Scotch, if anything, you're on your second or third sip and you're like, I just taste alcohol, like I cannot really work past this. You should not suffer through it and just toughen up. You have the power to lower the ABV. Your water bottle or these, water droppers here, you can actually add water, add small amounts to start because you can't take it back out, but actually adding water will lower the alcohol by volume and help some of those flavors come out.
There's no shame in that either. When I
No.
was in Scotland, like, absolutely, they totally.
They drink half and
encouraged
half
Yeah.
sometimes. They'll
Yeah.
put half whiskey, half water. So they're drinking a liqueur at that point. It's 20% ABV, or even lower. So it's your whiskey, do what you want with it. If you want to put it on the rocks, if you want to put it over ice, we are okay with that too. Just know that you're not gonna get the most explosive flavor experience when you take the temperature down of a whiskey. So room temperature is the best, which ice obviously is gonna give you some cooling effect.
What's the color difference?
Yes, so color, and then I'll let Charles jump in too.
Well, just one quick thing about, since we're talking about tasting too. I have what you call a 3-sip rule. Some of you've heard it before, but the first sip of any whiskey, even if it's your second, third, or fourth whiskey of a tasting, or if it's your first whiskey of the day, the first sip, don't judge the whiskey on that first sip, period. If you like it, wonderful. If you don't, okay, no big deal, but don't judge it on that first sip alone. The way you can kind of get a sense, not everything is going to come to you, but the way you can get a sense if it's something that you like or if it's something that your palate enjoys is on the second and third sip. Second sip, your palate's a little bit adjusted. It's not fully adjusted. It's just been bombarded by 40% plus ABV. But the second sip should be better than the first sip. If it's not, okay, again, don't judge it on the second sip, but it should be getting better. The third sip is really your true measure if it's something that you're probably going to like. Again, this isn't a hard line rule, but this is kind of a good way to know if it's something that you're going to enjoy or not. The third sip should be better than the second, so it should be progression. And then if you're good at the third, you're probably going to enjoy this whiskey. So, a lot of people, they take a whiskey, they taste it, they're like, oh, nope, can't do it. Drink some water, come back to it, try it again, second sip. If it's better, fine. If not, then maybe it's not for you, but don't judge it right away on that first sip.
The first sip of this was like rocket fuel for me.
Yeah, your palate has to get used
The
to it.
third sip was as smooth as can be.
Yeah.
It's amazing the difference
Yeah.
between first and third.
And, not only add water if it's too much alcohol, but make sure you're drinking water while you're drinking whiskey. We all kind of, what I find myself doing, and it's horrible, is you'll blow through a tasting and you've had hardly any water. And it's just the wrong way to do it. You need to be, taking in a lot of water as you're drinking. Not only will it help your body and your mind make it through all this alcohol, but it just helps with the tasting as well, keeps your palate fresh. It adds water naturally to the whiskey when your mouth is already wet from water. So it's just a really good thing. And there's more water in the back too, if you need more.
What's the ABV on this one?
On the second one?
48%.
We're in the second,
It's
48 on the
And we
second.
chose
Second
these.
one.
we're up to the second now, okay.
Well,
Style.
Yeah, I agree. The first one.
we're kind of, we're looking at both of these kind of side by side. So
Okay,
Okay.
question about the Glenlossie.
sure.
Holly said it's very rarely seen as a single malt.
Yes.
So it's probably used in blends. Do you know which it goes to?
It's Diageo,
I
so
don't
probably
taste
Johnny
smoke, but
Walker.
I'm getting a little smoke on the nose.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's a Diageo product. So they own 26 distilleries in Scotland. So,
What?
it's most likely Johnny Walker
They are the largest.
or some of their other big ones.
Thanks.
Yeah,
It's
that was
like
Peter.
for me, buttery.
So both of these, the first two, one is 48.4 and the other is 48.
Yes. But we haven't fully moved on to the second one yet. We just kind of started to nose it.
Whiskeys married together with that, so you wouldn't really be able to tell.
Listen, start again.
Charles, this has killed my whole theory about shaking a bottle and looking to see how many bubbles there are, because I would have put this as more alcohol, but
Yeah.
that's the end of that theory. Okay.
On the second one or the first one?
On the first or the second one, I shake the bottle to see how many bubbles there are, and I figure it's higher alcohol if there are bubbles, but that theory is now debunked. Okay.
Did she text?
Really funny.
Okay. I just went out to look and just to check to see if the door was.
And then I've
It
got
says.
the other guy,
Why
is it not too late?
One of us, all of us who've been there for a long time.
Can't blame it on the weather.
Yeah.
Just do like that.
And
I'm not sure how much Holly talked about this one yet. Did she?
not too much.
Not too much, okay. So the first whiskey that we had was a single malt. So one distillery. We know it's Glenlossie, 12 years old. This one is called, this is a blended malt. So it's taking multiple distilleries, barley, 100% malted barley, and blending those together. So Douglas Laing, which is actually the same company behind the first one, is also the same company that did this one. But this is a blended malt. So there's different types of blends in Scotland. The typical blends, which would be like Johnny Walker, Chivas, Dewar's, kind of the big brands that we've heard of over the years. Those are blends, but they include grain whiskey. Wow, that's interesting. Holly must be locked out. I'll be right back.
What's interesting is I'm getting.
You didn't say talk amongst yourselves, but I guess we could.
Hi, Peter.
Hello.
Hi, Amanda.
I see where they're coming from.
Hello.
That's question. She likes Scotch real quick, so I had her for Valentine's Day, got her a bottle.
Mhm. So how many, I guess I don't have everybody's picture going, but some people are new and some people are, what's the opposite, recycled? I mean,
Yeah.
Exactly like the short film.
Right, makes sense.
Yesterday.
I guess that's fun.
Yeah, this is my second event, so slowly but surely getting into the whiskey club.
Great.
Excellent.
Okay, are you local or are you delivery?
Yeah, I'm just over in Wilton.
Oh,
I'm not too far away.
Oh, okay.
Okay, good.
Or palate cleansers.
Yeah.
Before you drink the next whiskey, have either cucumber or some dark chocolate or crack.
My biggest thing was I just heard about the store like maybe last year, so I didn't even know there was a whiskey club until I talked to him.
Well, yeah, but they didn't start the store till
Get a sense of.
a year and a half or whatever it is, so.
Yeah, it
weren't
doesn't
that
sound like
late.
it's old.
Mhm.
Between whiskeys, these are.
Okay, so we had mentioned that there are different types of blends. So we have, we have the single malt here. We have what this is called is a blended malt. So different single malts put together. And then when you have Johnny Walker, Chivas, Dewar's, those are blends that include a grain whiskey. So when we say grain whiskey in Scotland, we mean basically anything but barley. So you're talking about corn or wheat or rye, even, I don't know if rye is considered a grain in Scotland. Yeah, rye. So basically anything but barley. But in order to be called a traditional blend in Scotland, again, like Johnny Walker, you have to include some grain whiskey. So it is different than a blended malt, which is what we're drinking here, which is again 100% malted barley. When you add grain, so when you do talk about Chivas and Dewar's, you are adding usually some sweetness. Corn, if it's being used, definitely gives whiskey a sweet note. Wheat will do the same thing. So, when you're drinking some of those, you're definitely getting a little bit of a sweeter. That's again why sometimes blends are more popular. They're also mass produced, but people do like sweet things.
So this is a blend.
So this is a blended malt though. So this is not your typical blend. So this is taking single malts from different distilleries, but barley and blending
So
those
it's
together.
still all barley.
It is all barley. So this is called a blended malt. So this is not to be confused with a regular blend in Scotland, a blended Scotch, which
You've
would,
heard of Monkey Shoulder
Yes.
Scotch whiskey? That's the only one that's become popular lately.
Yeah.
It's a very kind of underrated style of 100% malted barley based Scotch whiskeys. But they are becoming more popular because
yeah. And what we are noticing too, one of the things you have to look at, and initially I had all of these whiskeys in small little jars and I was going to leave them on the placemat and you could pour in what you wanted. But then I was looking at it, I was like, you need to see the color. And the only way to truly see the color is by pouring it into the glass. So I poured them out. And, you know, it's important to look at color because color is a huge part of how you identify what the whiskey is.
But it does not equal flavor.
No,
Darker does not equal more flavor.
right. But it will give you a hint of what kind of cask it was aged in. So, you know, with this first one, you know, and you want to talk about casks?
No, you can
You want
talk
me to
about
do
both
it?
of them, yeah.
Okay. So this first whiskey that we had is a refill barrel. So a refill barrel is a barrel that had whiskey in it prior. Okay, so it's not the first time it's ever held whiskey. Most barrels come from the US that are aged or that they use to age whiskey in all countries around the world. So when we're done making bourbon, which we'll taste a little bit later today, we have to do something with those barrels at that point. We can't use that barrel again for bourbon. Bourbon can only be aged in a new barrel each time. So once those barrels are finished, they're deconstructed typically and sent on pallets around the world, where they then will reconstruct those barrels back into various sizes. And then they're used for aging whiskeys in those countries. We do use some used barrels here in the United States now, because we also make single malt and some other things here in the US. But most of these barrels are sent abroad, where they're used for continuous aging of other people's whiskey. This one, just by looking at the color, you can see it's fairly pale gold color. This would indicate it would be an ex-bourbon barrel. You know, bourbon barrels typically, when they're used for refill or continuous aging in other countries, will be a very light color. The second whiskey that we're drinking, this actually comes from this is interesting, I've never actually seen this before, but it is a sherry butt. So we know sherry comes from Spain, bodegas in Spain, but they say that this is matured in a sweetly spiced sherry butt. So I don't know what that means, if they actually did something with the cask itself before the whiskey was put. Yeah, so casks have different names.
Juicy.
Yeah, so sherry, and it is butt with 2 T's as well. Sherry butts are very large barrels. Then you have port barrels coming from Portugal. Those are even larger. They're called pipes. But then you have in American barrels, when they're reconstructed in Scotland or Ireland or wherever they're making the whiskey, they have a choice. If they want to reconstruct a typical bourbon barrel, which is 53 gallons, or they can make it a little bit larger by adding more staves, and they can create what's called a hogshead. A hogshead barrel is 250 liters, whereas a typical American barrel is 200 liters. So it adds an extra 50 liters of volume, you know, between the whiskey and the wood, which actually, when you're using a little bit larger barrel, you have less interaction with the wood, which will also impart less color. So they don't say exactly if this is a regular size barrel or a hogshead bourbon barrel, but I have a feeling it's probably
Does it say
a regular.
barrel or
It
just
just
refill
says,
bourbon?
it just says refill barrel.
So
It's
I
probably
mean,
a regular size.
yeah, barrel is a bourbon.
Yeah, so this would be a typical 53 gallon barrel. And actually it is a little gold. So the gold, you know, gives it a little bit of a hint that it is a regular size barrel. If this was a hogshead barrel, 12 years, it might be a little lighter in color, just because there is that little bit of less wood to whiskey ratio during maturation.
Hey, Charles,
Yeah, go for it.
when you were talking about like making a blended whiskey, you were talking about introducing, you know, in certain types, right? Introducing grain whiskeys. Is corn always considered a grain in the whiskey world?
Well, so in the US, obviously, you know, we look at corn differently, but yes, outside of the US, corn would be considered a grain. You know, anything basically other than barley outside of the US is considered a grain.
Scotland's a little, they're pro barley, you'll notice. So
Yeah.
anything that's not barley is just called a grain. They just decided we don't care. We're not gonna actually give it a name. It's barley, and malted barley is like the king grain, which is the grain that they have grown. You know, that's what
Right.
grows there. I mean, they can grow other things, wheat and rye, but that is kind of their heritage grain. But when you go outside of that, it's not, those aren't inferior grains. It's just Scotland kind of lumps them all together, like as if barley is amazing and these other ones, yeah, we'll use them when we want them. And they're all called grains. So it's a little tricky with that sense, because then you get into America and corn is king, right? Because that's what we grew in Kentucky and Virginia when, you know, people were moving into, you know, moving further into the what would be the US and those states. So Scotland, you'll notice, is very partial to barley. They only give names to things that have barley involved with them, but they're not inferior. They're just, and we'll actually taste a single grain. Ireland has very similar rules to Scotland, and our fourth whiskey will be a single grain, which means it's 100% corn, more likely than not. So they do make those styles of whiskey, and you'll see they're really good. So, but Scotland just kind of turns yeah, it's good, but barley is the best.
Yeah, and it definitely is one of the underrated things in the world are single grains. So we talked about single malt, which again is 100% malted barley. And then we have, which we'll taste later, a single grain. We have blended malt, and then you have your regular blends, which include grain. But Scotland also does single grains. So like Holly mentioned, you know, it could be corn, which is typical, or it could be wheat. But those are some of the most underrated whiskeys that they produce in Scotland, but they get a bad rap because they're not barley. And again, Scotland has this affinity or love for barley. But some of those single grains are really good. And what's fun about those is in Scotland, unlike the US, when we age whiskey here in the US, we have hot climates, you know, like in Kentucky and Tennessee and Texas and all these other places. So we have a pretty high angel share or evaporation in the barrel. Whereas in Scotland, you know, it's cool climate pretty much all year round, 60 degrees, 50, 60 degrees. They have a smaller percentage of evaporation during their maturation, which means that you can age these things for longer in Scotland in these barrels than you can here in the United States. With the single grains, which again would be corn or wheat, in Scotland, if you can age those for a really long time, whereas here in the US, when we're making bourbon, we can't do that. And so we're really getting this they're some of the most underrated whiskeys, the single grains, and it's fun that we're going to be able to try one tonight, even though it's from Ireland. They do great single grains as well. But yes, in general, Scotland likes to poo single grain or grain whiskey in general, even though it is a beautiful thing when it's done right.
Yeah.
You know, some of the best whiskeys we've had in the shop are some of these really old single grains.
And they're a
You
great
know,
value too.
And they're
One
great.
that I have, it's a 30-year-old single grain Scotch Malt Whiskey Society.
Yeah.
I think it's probably one of the best whiskeys that I own.
Yeah.
And best whiskeys I've ever had.
Yeah.
And that bottle I had gotten, that was the first bottle I got from SMWS with my discount, and I think it was $200. It was worth every penny.
Yeah, so typically when you're looking at whiskeys, and this is kind of fun to talk about a little bit before we jump into Ireland and these other places, but when you're looking at buying whiskey in a shop like ours, when you're finding bottles like this, where it's an age statement, independent bottling from a distillery that you've never heard of before, the typical kind of rule of thumb should be about $10 per year of age. So this is 12 years. So you would not want to pay more than say $120 for this bottle. I said we sell it for quite a bit. It's 99 or something like that. Yeah. So it's actually less than that. But you know, when you get a 20-year-old or 25-year-old whiskey, again, you're trying to do the math in your head, and you want to know that you're not getting taken. The best, again, rule of thumb is $10 a year. Single grains, however, you know, we're not going to get too much into it because it will get too confusing, but you can find 30 or 35, 40-year-old single grains for $200. So almost half the price that you pay for single malt. So just interesting, you know, it's just a comparison again, you know, and then blends like blended malts. Blends are some of the best values out there in the whiskey world right now. Blended malts are fantastic. I mean, this Scallywag, I'm really digging this. This is really delicious. You know,
Charles,
yeah, go ahead, Peter.
to make that more confusing, that simple rule, how does it vary with the ABV?
It shouldn't vary too much with the ABV.
That's for single cast strength.
Yeah, I mean,
Rule of thumb.
you know, we're talking just for independent bottling. So
Okay,
Old Particular, they don't do high ABV generally with their independent bottling. So, you know, that $10 rule applies regardless.
thank you.
Yep.
Isn't the Glenlossie though, if you're going back and forth, it gets sweeter. It's just it's a subtle sweet. It's
Yeah.
like a candied ginger, which I find ironic that when I'm trying to get bourbon drinkers that are used to that heavy, dense, you know, thick sweetness from corn and the new oak, they think they want a Scotch that's been matured in X bourbon barrels because you're like, oh, I like bourbon. I'm going to like bourbon matured whiskeys from Scotland and Ireland. But they tend to actually be more delicate, the bourbon matured. They're citrus and, you know, apples and custard. They're a little bit more of what I call thinker whiskeys. They're kind of, you have to unravel them a little bit. Where the Scallywag, which is sherry matured, which a lot of people are not drinking sherry regularly. So we don't really have a point of reference of what sherry tastes like necessarily, but a lot of times that has that thicker, sweeter, denser quality to it. So that is you know, if you're a bourbon drinker trying to get into Scotch, you actually ironically don't necessarily want to start with a bourbon matured Scotch. You might want to look at a sherry or port matured where it can give some heavy kind of dense thickness to it, and maybe even sweeter. Like I find the Scallywag, it's called the chocolate edition. They kind of put the word in your brain now, but it's supposed to, they think it tastes like chocolate. So you can decide, but.
Yeah,
Is
another.
there a shelf life for these, and does that vary between blends and single grain or single?
So there really isn't a shelf life once it's opened. You know, there have been studies that have been done that have looked at how much whiskey is left in the bottle before the oxidation actually makes a difference. And some pretty big studies have been done in the Netherlands about it because they're real whiskey nerds there. And once you get down to about where this bottle is, about a quarter or so, that's when you probably want to just finish it and not let it sit forever on your shelf. But anything really above that doesn't really make a difference. And it doesn't matter if it's a blended malt or a single malt.
Just asking because I live by myself.
Yeah, no, but
Like,
once you
okay, I got
get,
that much, let everybody come on over.
yeah, seriously, once you get to about this, I mean, it'll still last for a while, but if it's sitting there for years,
Yeah.
it will change.
Sure.
And I've had some that I've opened that I've been like, ah, darn it, you know, I should have took
Are
care
any
of that.
types more susceptible to the oxidation than others?
Probably lower ABV.
Yeah,
Potentially,
yeah.
if it's
Yeah.
40% and you've
Right.
got it, but if it's pretty high in alcohol, you've probably got a better shot
Yeah,
of it.
totally.
Because it's oxidation, so
Yeah.
if you can just let it hang in there a little bit longer, or transfer it to a smaller bottle.
Container,
Yeah, if you go on Amazon, you can get any size vial you could ever imagine, 1 ounce,
Yeah,
2 ounce.
that's always a
5
good idea.
ounce.
Put it in
Label it,
smaller
because you
bottles.
will
For
forget
sure, oh yeah.
what. I have many bottles, I'm like, I have no idea. The ultimate blind
I'm
tasting.
gonna guess it's whiskey.
Yes.
One other thing that's kind of fun to just understand the differences between these bottles. So Holly mentioned that's 1 barrel, so it's, I think, 248 bottles. This one is a limited edition, but the limited edition in this case is 3,600 bottles. So that just tells you how many barrels they've kind of put together. But a limited edition to one distillery or one brand can be completely different in size to a limited edition for another. So for example, we have somewhere on the shelf back there, one of our earlier tastings, we did a Johnny Walker. It was part of their oh, what's the movie? Darn it, Blade Runner. It was part of their Blade Runner limited edition, you know, and it was like 30,000 bottles, you know. So for Johnny Walker, you know, that's their limited release is 30,000 compared to Douglas Lang's 3,600 bottles. So it's just kind of fun. Again, you can get really nerdy with these things, but
It's the same with small batch too.
yes,
A small batch for Jack Daniels is very different than a small batch for your craft distillery down the road. So
Right.
there's no legal definition for small batch. It is a marketing term at this point. So it's just a batch. That's all it is. It's just a batch of casks.
Okay, Charles,
yeah,
so with the Scallywag blended malt, is this something that Douglas Lang would have done the blending, getting the various
yes,
single malts and done it? Okay,
yep. So they went and sourced the barrels from different distilleries and put it together.
And this is a special release because it's, if you're familiar, Peter, I'm sure you probably are with the blended malt range of Douglas Lang, but Scallywag is not normally this heavy on the sherry. So this is their chocolate limited edition where it's fully matured in sherry casks. Which sherry casks, again, we don't drink a lot of sherry. So if you like Macallan and Glenfarclas and Glendronach, things like Scallywag that are matured in these sherry casks, they tend to be more expensive because the barrels are worth more than sherry.
okay.
Bourbon is very popular, right? We have access to bourbon barrels. That's good and great. But sherry, they're actually very, very expensive to get sherry casks now. So you tend to pay a little bit more and people, it's sought after because it's just harder to get sherry matured Scotch and Irish.
And it's gotten to a point now where you have larger companies like Macallan and then the owners of Macallan who actually own bodegas in Spain so that they know they're going to get those barrels when that's sherry is done. So, you know, it's and the barrels of sherry now are around $1,000 compared to the bourbon barrels, which are around $150, $200
For the empty.
for the empty spent barrel.
Nothing's in it.
They're really
Yes, they're
big.
big. They are big.
They are.
Price difference between Macallan Fine Oak and Macallan Sherry, big price difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah, so there's, again, like I said at the beginning, all of these countries kind of depend on each other. So, you know, Scotland, Ireland, they depend on the US to make bourbon because they want those bourbon barrels. Because, you know, they make a lot of whiskey with those and 70% is, or 80% is bourbon barrels that are used now.
So before they had access to our bourbon barrels, what were they?
Well, they were using a lot of European oak. So, you know, whether it was sherry or cognac or port or whatever from Europe or even local forests, you know, there were forests in Ireland and Scotland that they used for a period of time as well, but those they don't really depend, they can't anymore. There's not enough wood
And what,
for that.
so was it just the access? It wasn't like, oh, that oak they have is so much better for our product than what we had access to. over
It was
here?
more of a volume kind of situation, you know. Initially whiskey wasn't really being aged in wood. You know, they were drinking pretty much straight spirit off of a still, you know, when 500 years ago, when they first invented whiskey,
Well, it's a
it
cold
was
climate up
not
there, so-
something that they were
Yeah.
aging. Yeah,
It was how they transported it.
yeah,
Yeah,
The Teeling folks call the oak cask, back in the day, that was your Tupperware container. Like that was ingenious. It was, you didn't have plastic totes. You didn't, how do you move things from, you know, even a couple miles, you know, a liquid? There was no, and then they realized, oh, we can actually, woodworkers, cooperages, this stuff doesn't leak too often. It's porous, it swells and expands. It was actually like the modern day you know, a tote, plastic tote, and it happened to work. So, and think of, you know, the English in the, I mean, I don't, 1800s, they're drinking a lot of sherry. So it was no problem. The sherry was not being bottled in glass at that time. It was coming over in casks, and then they would drink the sherry, and then voila, oh, we'll use that, right? We've got it. It doesn't leak. We can let it sit and store it, and then it, you know, it was organically kind of how you just held liquid.
And certain wood is better for using for barrels. And, you know, it was quickly found out that white American oak was a great wood to be reused over and over and over again. It wouldn't leak, and you could use it 3 or 4 times before it lost its flavor or what it added to the whiskey. So, you know, and it turned out that we had a lot of it, you know, and to the point now where not only do some distilleries own bodegas or places where they make sherry, but some are invested in our forests here in the US and our cooperages, the barrel makers here in the US, to guarantee that they're getting our bourbon barrels from wood from the US. So it's all very intertwined. And one of the things that, you know, people worry about sometimes, and it's never going to happen, but it gets thrown about a little bit, is if the US ever changed its laws or rule on bourbon, that it has to be a new barrel. If they ever said, oh, well, screw that, we'll do second barrels, third barrels for bourbon, that would truly disrupt the entire world's whiskey production. So it's not going to happen. I mean, there's too much money being made already with the way it is, but it's an interesting thought to know how it is all very intertwined.
You had a question too.
Yeah, is there like a minimum for like, I know 12 years you said it was like.
Oh, good question. So you're asking if there's a minimum age for whiskey. So typically in Scotland and Ireland, it's 3 years. So you're really looking at 3 years as kind of your minimum.
To put Scotch on the label.
To call it whiskey in general. In the US, we don't really have minimums. Bourbon doesn't have a minimum. It can be 6 days old if you want. If it is young though, like that, you have to say how old it is. So if it is 6 days old, it needs to say on the bottle 6 days. Anything under 4 years basically has to state an age on it. But you know, most of the world you're looking at 3 years. But for a long time, and it just until recently, it was always thought of that whiskey needed to be older. It needed to have an age statement in order to have some recognition or prestige or whatever. That's a bunch of hogwash. And the Scots were slow to adapt to that until they realized that the demand for older whiskey was more than they could handle. And then they started to have to remove ages from some of their whiskeys so that they could blend some younger malt together with the older malt because they just ran out. But they also realized by doing that, that there's great whiskey that's younger. And now there is no idea of it has to be 10 years or 8 years or 12 years in order for it to be decent. Some of the best whiskeys I've had in my life from both Scotland and Japan are 3 to 4 years old. So, you know, I think that age is just more of a, you know, show off statement more than anything at this point. There is something to be said about age. There is beautiful older Scotch whiskey. American whiskey, you can't get too old again because we mentioned the climate before, but you know, there is something about age, but it's not necessarily defining how good or bad a whiskey is. No. So hope that answered.
It did, no, thank you.
Why don't you do Raasay, because you know more about Raasay than I do.
Oh, I mean, they're new, so we're all gonna taste this one together. This actually just hit the States. So I love the bottle. It's a Seidewand. What was the favorite between, since they're both Speyside and we're gonna move to peated, Glenlossie or Scallywag?
Scallywag. I think Scallywag, because it was more complicated and it took me longer to warm up to it. But the other was very drinkable, like right away.
Crushable.
And
Yeah.
very, very enjoyable.
Mhm.
So it would be, I guess if I had to choose, I'd go with the Scallywag,
Okay,
but I
but
did
you
like
choose
both.
both. Well, I'm glad we had a Glenlossie too. Yeah, we don't want to.
Very close.
And I like saying it, so that's fine.
Just a little bit, but it was hard to say which one was my favorite. They
Yeah.
Both had interesting characters.
Yeah, I mean, we chose them because they were so drastically different. But
Sure.
you know, they obviously have a lot in common. So yeah, those were fun to taste side by side, but I knew Scallywag would probably pull through as the winner, so that's okay. We're going to go to the peated side of Scotch whiskey. So if you are an Isla or a Lafroig or a Lagavulin fan, this is not that heavily peated, so I'm sorry to ruin your night.
Won't be ruined.
But we are coastal island. So we are, if I wish I had brought the map of Scotland. Really peated?
Yeah, so I.
Oh, it's really good. Yeah.
I love peat, but like a ton of peat.
Yeah.
And this, I didn't. I
On the
think I
palate,
already
it's a little
stopped
bit
and
bigger.
tasted it and I didn't notice
Yeah.
it was.
So this is a medium peated malt. It's so Raasay is an island on that western coast. Just go to Google Maps, you know, after a few drinks and just look at Google Earth and how amazing that western coast of Scotland is. There's hundreds and hundreds of islands off that coast. Some have people on them, some don't. You could spend your 800 lives just exploring all of those thousands of islands. It's really a magical scene. Now, some of them do have people on them, and even better, some of them have distilleries, so that's good. The main one that everyone has heard of, if you're a Scotch whiskey fan, is Islay, which is where you get those very, very heavy peat smoke, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Lafroig, where you crack open the bottle and you can smell it from across the room. So very polarizing. Because they're so polarizing, a lot of people think all Scotch is peated. You just tasted examples A and B that actually most Scotch has no peat or smoke whatsoever. The peated process is, we're talking about barley, we're still with single malt again. The peated process is you go out to the field, right? You get your barley seeds. The barley seeds right out of the field actually are, you'd chip your tooth if you popped it into your mouth. It's hard, it's full of starch. But we know that we can convert that starch into sugar, and yeast can eat sugar to make us alcohol. So we know where we can get with starch, but we have to do a few things up front. So we actually steep all of those barley corns or barley seeds in hot water, and we let it think that it's safe in the ground, that it's going to sprout a new plant, that it's all damp. And there's actually enzymes working to break down all of that starch, and it's starting to convert it into sugar. But right before it sprouts that new barley plant, we selfishly want to stop that because it's going to eat all of our sugar to grow that new plant, and we want alcohol out of that sugar. So we're going to quickly dry out that grain after we've steeped it in hot water and let it sit for a bit. So that drying process right at the beginning, kind of the farming phase, harvesting phase of Scotch whiskey, that's where back in the day, your fuel source to start a fire or to have any sort of energy was to burn peat bogs. So to dig into the earth and actually get bogs, which is very, very, very young coal. Millions of years later, it eventually would be another type of fuel source, but you can smell people heating their homes with these peat bogs as you drive on these coastal, more rural areas of Scotland. So it's, to me, being raised in upstate New York, that smell there, it was wild, right? Like that's not how I heated my home in Rochester, New York. So that's why it can be very polarizing and very exciting to a lot of people, or very foreign. But that peat smoke, think of a sieve floor. So they're gonna actually just spread all of that damp barley out on the sieve floor. You're gonna have a kiln underneath. You're gonna start that fire, and for many, many hours, you're just gonna let that peat smoke actually rise up and attach to the damp grain as the grain is drying. And that's what you're tasting all the way through. Then you're gonna actually grind and mill the grain. You're gonna do what's called mashing and add some more hot water again a second time to continue to get more sugar. Add that yeast and make a beer. That's that next step. And then once we have that beer, we have our alcohol now, that's when we're gonna go into distillation and eventually maturation. So you're talking that whole process at the distillery and then 10, 12, however many years, and you can still taste what they did to that grain back at the beginning. And I think that's why a lot of people like it, because it's, I don't think that we should use terroir in whiskey, but you've got a little bit of that local earth, right? You know, you've got a little bit, and different parts, different peat bogs within the world, but especially within Scotland, will give you different flavors. So if you are on a coastal island or on the coast of Scotland, you're gonna basically what passed away in that region, it's gonna be marine life and seaweed, and you're gonna have more of that coastal salinity, briny, some people say band-aids or medicinal qualities. If you take from a peat bog that's landlocked in the heart of Scotland, you're going to get more of a floral, you know, shrub sort of earth that has passed away in that region. You're not going to get that medicinal. You're going to get more of this floral smoke. So Raasay is an island. It's actually right around Skye. So if anyone's heard of Talisker or Skye, it's right in there. There's about 120 people that live on the island. And 20 of them work for the distillery. So it's a pretty big deal that this distillery is there. They're the only distillery on the island. The founders are entrepreneurs in different industries, and they're also planning to build a second distillery on the border of England and Scotland as well, so a lowland distillery. But someone told them, hey, you should, you know, go onto this island. It's accessible by ferries. I don't think Charles has been there.
No, not yet.
Neither Charles or I have been there. It's only about 6 or 7 years old, and this is their first release. So lightly peated, you know, a little bit of that smoke, mostly for me on the palate, but it's got a nice.
Is when I really
it's
noticed
very
it.
Yeah,
Not so much
it's-
up front, it's afterwards.
Yeah.
Very salty, very briny. It's got, you can tell it's from an island.
Brings you to the coast.
It does,
Yeah, brings you to
absolutely
the
does.
seaside. So I was excited to try. This is my first time tasting it as well.
It's salty, briny.
Taste the salt.
Yeah.
It's definitely
can smell it, too.
lightly peated,
Yeah.
but it has a very much of I get more of a barbecue note on it than I do.
Yeah, I
like
could see that, like a
than
sweet barbecue
Yeah,
sauce.
then an
Yeah.
Isla.
That's what I had, barbecue
Mhm.
smoke on my.
Yeah.
nose.
It's not punch you in the face, it's
No.
intertwined into the fruit, the natural fruit that you get from a barley single malt. So this is definitely one to keep an eye on. I think we're gonna see a lot of cool.
So how many
Cool things
bottles
from
did they go in their first round?
Oh, this release, I'm not sure. They
I mean,
did
they're
release
fairly
three
small,
single
right?
casks as well.
Fairly small.
Yeah, they're very small. I don't know if this is 46.4% as well, ABV.
I like that one.
Oh, this is interesting. So they produced peated and unpeated malt, and then they made unpeated and peated whiskeys and then married them together. The peated whiskeys were matured in ex-American rye casks. So if you got some spice, maybe you're a good palate. Ex-Chinkapin oak, which is that you might be getting some of that barbecue actually from
The
the
Chinkapin,
Chinkapin
yeah.
too. It's an alternative to, it's another style of it's called Quercus elba, which is American oak. But it's being used more often, but it can give you kind of a meaty note to it. And Bordeaux casks. So there is some red wine. Then the unpeated has been in all the same three. So the peated and the unpeated were all living in these different types of casks and then married together. So that's a pretty cool blending process. Yeah, that's probably a simple one too, with how many. Yeah, it's just I really love the
I like
bottle.
this.
So
They
they,
put all that on the little label, I guess it's not that complicated.
yeah, they were able to do a little bit of an explanation. And usually for peated whiskey, it might be on their website, but they'll tell you ppms or parts per million. So that's how much of smoke level is actually in the whiskey. So like Ardbeg, Lafroig, you're looking at 40 to 50 ppm. I would say this is like 15 to 20, if that. So it's just a lower phenol count of smoke. So you can actually measure the smoke
That
level.
was like 180. I
Yeah.
forgot which one that was, but it's whatever they served me at the 980.
The one issue with your light peated Scotch and you look at parts per million of smoke in the whiskey. I remember being told when I was at a distillery in the Highlands that you have to be a little careful because you can measure parts per million of smoke in the grain after you smoke it and put that on the label, or you can measure it after it's matured for however many years, because you're gonna have less smoke influence left in the final whiskey.
I moved it, got rid of that.
So some people like to really push the parts
Like
per
that,
million
yeah.
of smoke, yeah.
Because I'll tell you, you would think it's undrinkable, just when you
But it's,
ask, but
it is drinkable.
honestly,
yeah.
it's one of the best peated whiskeys I've ever had.
Mhm.
And it does kind of linger on your breath for a while.
Yeah, you can smell it. It stays in your hair follicles a little bit in your
So,
skin.
to me, peat doesn't always taste smoky though.
That's a good point. And
I really like peat, but I don't really like smoke.
Mhm.
And it's not the same thing to me.
It's not this, it actually isn't, but a lot of times they come together.
Yeah.
And you are peat smoking the barley, so just the term smoking is kind of a part of the conversation, but you're 100% correct that, and actually when you get nosing kits, they have all these nosing kits now and blending kits, and peat is separate from smoke. They can be together, and a lot of times they are found together, but you can get smoke from different types of wood. You can actually smoke grains without using peat. So you can actually get a true soot smoke that is separate from that earthen, medicinal peat as well.
So like, I really like a lot of peat flavor, but without the smoke flavor, so it's hard to find for me, because I don't know how to
Bottles are beautiful.
like tell which ones are the smoky peat. or which ones are the-
Well, and it's personal too, it's
Yeah.
hard. What have you found that is peated but not smoky to you?
So, like, the Ryeconic Port Charlotte heavily peated.
Okay, yeah.
I like that one, and there's
Mhm.
one that a friend brought over one time that I really loved, and I don't remember what it's called, but I think he sent me a picture, so I can.
Is this smoky or peaty?
This. It's kind of, I do get a little smoke, but it's not an overpowering smoke.
Yeah.
When I first tasted it, I did not taste peat at all until like I don't know, I had a piece of chocolate and I had some things and then tasting it a few times, like you said. And then I got like a little peat, but it doesn't give me that, ooh, that peat.
Yeah, this is not your, take over your sinuses peat. It's another extra bonus to the single.
Yeah, and I mean, with these, that rule is really true, Not only is it alcohol that we have to get our palate adjusted to, but the peat, so again, some people have had bad experiences in their past with their grandfather's Scotch or whatever, and they tasted it and it
Like
brings, whiskey is all about memories also. It brings you back to taste profiles and all that.
Like one time I had a storm that just like it was like eating a campfire and
I didn't find that his peat.
But you got to
It's
use the
personal.
rule. You really need to use the rule for all of these, and keep water.
Yeah, so we need to drink.
Charles, Holly,
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
is this distillery doing its own malting? Do they have their own floor malting, or are they
No, they don't.
specifying to someone else what they want?
Yeah, we don't think so.
No, I don't think they have their own floor malting.
Okay, thank
They're
you.
really small.
Yeah. Yeah, so drink lots of water, have a cracker, because we're about to get a little bit more delicate. Actually, this one's pretty heavy. but we're not gonna go into peated anymore.
It could have been this one.
Kilhoman,
Yeah.
you liked that one?
Maybe. I asked him, what was that really peaty one?
I love
And
that
he
one.
said,
It's probably
he said, was it this one? I think this is the only really peaty one I have in those.
Yeah.
You know, with this one, but when you guys are looking at your glasses, just look at how this one sticks to your glass too.
The mouthfeel on this one is really good.
It's really amazing.
Yeah.
So, how do you say that?
Raasay.
Yep.
Yeah, I like the.
So we have,
of that one.
typically when we do our tastings, and everybody does it differently, but I've always used cucumbers. These are English sliced cucumbers. Really great palate cleansers. And dark chocolate. This one is 85%, which is typically good with Scotch. When you get into sweeter, like American whiskeys, like bourbon and stuff, you want to go a little lower on the percentage, so maybe 70% dark chocolate, but very good palate cleansers. And what we've used in the past, which I have over here, but it gets a little crazy. You can also cleanse your nose. This is just ground coffee, and you can smell it, and it's, you know, not everybody believes in this, but we have it out in case people do. But and just plain crackers. You don't want crackers that have, you know, too many herbs or spices, because it'll ruin your palate. But water and these things is great.
Yeah, no garlic.
Yeah, no garlic.
I don't even, no scented deodorant. We are not allowed scented soap in the house anymore. I have some pretty strict rules. I don't wanna mess up my nose. You'd be surprised. You have like a real, when someone comes into the shop with like a strong perfume or deodorant, and like your senses, when you're paying attention to that a lot, you'll start to notice how like little scents can just totally like throw you for a loop.
I
But
can't
then you can't
stand
smell.
like artificial air fresheners.
Yeah,
and, like,
no, not allowed.
The car freshener
Not allowed.
drive me nuts.
Like
Unnecessary.
I have a couple of scented candles, but I'm very picky about them and I don't burn them down.
All right, so we're gonna move on. I know this is what happens with Whiskey 101. You kind of just,
Yeah, we were excited.
there's just a
for
lot
this
of
class, so.
questions, and it's great. I mean, we love this. That's why we do it. But we're gonna move on to Ireland. Ireland, like Scotland, Ireland has different styles of whiskey. They do single malt. Single malt is now being made quite a bit in Ireland. Yeah, so upper left. So with single malt, again, that would be 100% malted barley. Yeah, so different styles in Ireland. Everybody thinks Jameson, they think Bushmills, you know, those are the big brands. But lots of other styles are being made. But to talk a little bit about Ireland, they do make, we're not having this tonight, but one of the styles of whiskey that they do is pot still Irish whiskey. So think of Redbreast, the Green Spots, you know, there's lots of different pot still Irish whiskeys out there. But what that is, take it and make it even a little bit more difficult to remember any of what we're talking about tonight. That is barley, but it's a percentage of it is malted and a percent that's not malted. So it's not a single malt, which would be 100% malted barley. It's typically a combination of 60% or so malted barley and 40% unmalted barley. And back in the 19th century, this style of whiskey was developed mainly to avoid having to pay taxes on the malted barley that the English were taxing them on. So it was one way to kind of skirt the rules, but in the meantime, it created a new style of whiskey, which is really beautiful. Some of our favorite whiskeys from Ireland are the pot still style Irish whiskeys. This, however, is a single grain. So we talked a little bit about grain whiskey before, which is typically used for blends. So if you are making Jameson, which is the most popular whiskey in the world, unfortunately, it is a combination of malted barley and grain whiskey. Very sweet. Most of that comes from the grain side of it. And most of that's what gives you the bad hangover later. But
I think it's just also the volume that is usually
Yes,
consumed.
yes.
How you drink it.
yes. It's
I don't think anyone's really tasted it
yeah.
necessarily.
Right.
Well, you don't really want to.
There's some
You wanna-
older
you wanna
expressions
get it
too.
over.
We're just joshing.
I'm sure
Yeah.
Laing and
No, no,
James.
I'm not bashing we're not bashing Jameson. We love Jameson. We,
They've kept the Irish whiskey industry alive, so
Yes.
we do have to give them.
No,
some
I
credit.
like going to
And this
Middleton.
was made at
Middleton
in
is a good
Middleton.
place.
So give
Yeah.
it credit where credit is.
Yeah, but we are drinking tonight, what again is a little bit unusual. It's not a typical style of whiskey that you drink from Ireland even. This is a single grain. And what's really cool about this bottle is that it says a lot. So High and Wicked is the bottler. So High and Wicked actually is an American
The guy from
company.
Brown Foreman.
Yeah. So it's an American company that has decided to get casks from different places and bottle them under their High and Wicked brand.
So
We-
similar to Old Particular.
Yeah, so Old
From
Particular is an
Scotland, yeah.
independent baller. But this one is called Aeneas Coffey Single Grain Irish Whiskey. And they even tell you on the bottle what the grain is. So sometimes you don't know what the grain is. You think most likely it's corn or it could be wheat or rye. This one says right on the bottle, 95% French maize, which is corn. So we know right away that it's corn. Now, however, this is interesting. It does say 5% malted Irish barley. I thought always that a single grain had to be 100%. No, I guess not. I was wrong.
And it's on a column still. So even
That's
if it was
important.
100%.
Yeah, so,
barley.
This one's called Aeneas Coffey, which is interesting. It has nothing to do with coffee that we drink, from Colombia or wherever. This is a gentleman from Ireland who back in I think it was around the turn of the century, created a new invention, and he was Irish. And he went to the Irish distillers and was like, hey, I created this new style of making whiskey, which actually used. So when you see pictures of distilleries, typically you see these big, beautiful pot stills, especially in Ireland. You see these big, beautiful pot stills. And in Ireland, they triple distill a lot of their whiskey. So you see 3 of these big pot stills right next to each other. Well, that was the old way of making whiskey back in the day. They used these kind of more bulbous stills, but Aeneas Coffey created what we call today a column still, which is a very, very tall column still made of copper. But basically a column still has many plates in it. It runs 24/7, so it's continuous still, but it's used more for making grain whiskeys. So for corn, wheat, rye. And now when you think about it, when you have Jameson, you have the mass volume that they produce for Jameson, a column still is hugely important because it's making all of that grain whiskey that goes into that blend. So he invented this column still. He went to these distillers in Ireland and said, hey, I have this 24/7 still, you can run it, make all this whiskey. They basically raised their noses to him and said, no, we're not interested. We want to stick to our traditions and our big pot stills. So he ended up going to Scotland with this idea and sold them on it. And they loved it. They were making a lot of blended whiskey at the time. And so this was a way to mass produce grain whiskey, which is used for blends. So Scotland, because of this, one of the reasons why Scotland overtook Ireland in making whiskey was because of an invention by an Irish guy who was unable to sell it to his own people. So now they do use it. Everybody uses it pretty much around the world. We use it when making bourbon as well. You see these big, huge, tall column stills in Kentucky and other places in the US. but he was the inventor. So this is a single grain Irish whiskey that's 50% ABV, so 100 proof. It starts in ex-bourbon barrels. So that's the initial barrels, but then it's finished for 6 months in Tinta Negra Madeira cask. So another form of sherry. They actually have the name of the bodega, which is this Tinta Negra. But this is Madeira. So Madeira, there's different types of sherry. There's Oloroso sherry, there's Madeira, and there's Pedro Jimenez. Those are the three that you most commonly see, but there's actually, I think, over 20 different styles of sherry. But those are the three that you see most often where casks are used. And Madeira gives a very beautiful quality. Oloroso will be this kind of dark, almost dried raisin fruit, whereas Madeira gives us this kind of more, I don't know, it's kind of a lighter, juicier, not as tart kind of note for me. I don't know.
Madeira neat just is really good.
Yeah.
Like just buy a bottle of Madeira on the rocks. I was drinking that during COVID. Just a little. You know,
So this one is interesting
research.
too.
Research, yeah.
They say on here that there were 1,500, if I can, 1,500 9-liter cases. So they don't tell you how many bottles of this were
And the
made.
case could be 3, 6, or 12.
Yeah, so it's 1,500
definitely
9-liter
decide what-
cases, released in April of last year. And they say double cask matured because we were in bourbon first and then 6 months in Madeira. But 50%, so we've gone up a tiny bit in ABV.
So this was
Keep that in
probably
mind.
destined to go into an older Jameson release. I think that's why this is so cool. It's Middleton Distillery outside of Cork, where Jameson and Redbreast and all those big brands, Powers, all of those patties,
Ooh,
where they're all produced.
this is fun.
They don't sell, you know, they were the last ones standing when Irish whiskey fell after they left the crown in the early 1900s. World War I then pushed them down even further. I mean, they had a lot going against Ireland for a long time. And all of these distilleries came together, and you had Bushmills in the north and you had everyone else just merged together in Middleton. You know, Jameson was its own standalone. Powers, Patties, those were all individual distilleries, and they just all came together to survive during the mid 1900s. And they didn't, you know, it was very kind of buttoned up. They just made what they made. And I've personally never seen Middleton in an independent bottler. Usually it's, now there's lots of, it's been a renaissance in the past 30, 40 years. But
You
it's
usually see
very,
Cooley, but you don't see
yeah,
Middleton.
it's very rare for you to see their whiskey make it out to other people. But like we said, the family member of the Brown Foreman family who owns Jack Daniels and Woodford Reserve, and Old Forester, founded this bottling company. So he must have some friends that he was able to get some casks from Middleton Distillery, and then he did this finish on the whiskey. So it probably would have been casks that were destined to go into an older release of Jameson. You know, that heavy corn. It's got a, you know, that crumbly sugar cookie quality to it. You know, it's got that sweet crumble, and I think the Madeira gives some nice, you know, baking spice intertwined, kind of some citrus orange peel. I really liked this whiskey. I thought it was a solid ABV. I liked
But
the
it tastes-
mouthfeel.
It doesn't taste as high in alcohol because it tastes sweeter. to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
hides
the
it
Madeira is,
a little
yeah.
bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just
I mean,
like-
sherry
just
can
like
do
fruity
that.
smoothies hide the taste.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sherry can do that in general sometimes, even with the higher ABV single barrels. You know, I've noticed that, you know, that whenever you add that sweetness, whether it's the raisin or, you know, whatever those dark fruit notes that you get, or even chocolate notes sometimes from sherry, it does hide the alcohol. It can be dangerous a little bit. I think this is really fun. This is really fun.
Yeah,
This is one of those, remember we talked earlier about how an older single grain, you know, we talked about that. This, I bet with another 10 years would be like off the charts, incredible. Not
This is,
era, but
this is a very interesting whiskey. I mean, you get the corn taste, some sweetness, but it's nothing like bourbon. And you get the sherry notes. It's almost like a sherry finished light whiskey.
yeah, you know, you're right, Rich. It does have a little bit of those, like our Obtainium.
Yeah.
Have that kind of strawberry note. I'm actually getting some of that fresh berry note on this too. And maybe that's what you get from a combination of corn and Madeira, is that kind of berry note, which would make it similar to a light whiskey.
All right, should we go into cast
Yeah, we
strength
probably
time?
should.
Yeah. Should we go into some bourbon? Yeah, although everyone in here is a Scotch fan, so look at that, and that never happens.
Like, if you didn't tell me these were Scotch, except for maybe the peated ones, like the first two, like, I wouldn't have thought they were Scotch. But I think that's because of that.
Well, and there's so many Scotches, actually,
perception.
you can get so many different flavors out of single malt Scotch in all of the distilleries. Then you can, no offense to bourbon, bourbon is kind of backed into a corner, right? You have very strict rules. As USA, there's a lot of rules, but the big ones on flavor are at least 51% corn. Usually it's much higher in the 70%. So you've got that bold sweetness. We just tasted a corn whiskey, that bold sweetness, and then it has to be matured in new charred American oak. So you're going to get all of that heavy, intense oak influence. And, you know, you can do a lighter toast, or you know, there's different grains that you can use and wheat and things like that. But at the end of the day, bourbon is kind of in this corner, and there's some ways to get other flavors in there. But Scotland and Ireland, I mean, I'm not, you know, partial to anything, but they have their rules, but it's very wide open compared to the United States in regards to maturation. So with the 130 distilleries, they're all different.
The Raasay that they, you know, it's still Scotch, but they did all those. it
Other
seems like
oak
complicated,
maturations, yeah. So yeah, Scotland is there's so many varying flavors to look at. But in bourbon, we will stick to our rules now. So we're back to new charred American oak. You'll notice from the shop, if you've been in the shop, we tend to like cask strength as well. So we're gonna jump up in alcohol pretty quickly here, but your palate is ready for it. So you'll all be prepared. This is bottled at 57.5% ABV. So this is natural cask strength. It came out of the barrel like this.
Don't forget to drink water.
Drink water, you have the water droppers, drink slow. This one, we really, a lot of times in American whiskey, we don't have a ton of information about where it came from or how many casks went into it. We don't actually, I don't think we know even the mash bill for this. I would assume it's high corn. Maybe Charles can look and see if they disclosed it anywhere. We know that it is 6 years old. It is a single barrel, and it might have bottle count. Nope. So it's a 6-year bourbon, and this is from New England Barrel Company. So it's become really popular in the American whiskey world. Is to start a distillery means that you have to be a little cuckoo in the brain and have about $3 to $4 million to blow as well. And then to sit on whiskey and hope you think it tastes good, but then you're gonna let it sit for a bunch of years and invest in oak and then have to invest in marketing and branding and hope that other people like it. It actually, if you didn't ever say the word whiskey, it would sound like a really terrible business idea, and no bank would ever support
So-
anything.
So where are
70
they at? Where are they located?
75
Hampshire.
corn. It's a 75.
It's the MGB.
So
This is 75% corn, 21% rye, 4% malted barley. So now we're not talking about single malts, single grains from one distillery. We obviously had a little bit of the 5% malted barley in the Irish one, but in bourbon, you talk a lot about these mash bills or recipes. This is what's called a classic MGP or Midwest Grain Products mash bill. There is a large distillery in Indiana called MGP, a very lovely name. They make a lot of whiskey, and a lot of brands will buy that whiskey and then let it mature for longer, maybe finish it, blend it themselves. And they really all, even though they're comparable mash bills, they really do taste different based off of who's blending it. So this is a single barrel pick from New England Barrel Company. We like to support them. I've liked a lot of the whiskeys that I've tasted from them. He's actually the founder, James, is going to be in Saratoga next week as well. So we're going to talk to him, but he's right in New Hampshire. So just a guy like us that loved whiskey and was always, you know, shopping at whiskey shops and going to tastings. And he wanted to start, he thought he could blend and pick some of his own barrels and is having to go at it, not building his own distillery, maybe someday, but he is buying whiskey from other distilleries and then marrying it how he sees fit. And that's how it will be for this rye whiskey that we taste next as well.
There's a lot going on in this.
Yeah.
I got cherries and chocolate and the spice, that explains the 21% rye.
Yeah.
It's a little higher in rye. That's why right away, I mean, the sweetness tells me it's bourbon right away. But I was getting that back note of cherries, which I get a lot in, give you an example, Whistle Pig Boss Hog 7. That you really taste that cherries and chocolate and everything else. And that's a rock.
Yeah. You definitely get very bold, you know, there's no citrus to be found. There's no floral notes typically to be found in a bourbon whiskey. But if you like that flavor profile, I mean, it just takes over your nose and palate. I mean, they're very bold, they're intense, lots of flavor. And if you like it, you like it.
Reminds me of Stella.
Yeah, I haven't had this one. The last single barrel I had from them tasted like pancakes and fried dough. Like, it was so good. It was a 7-year-old single barrel. So he obviously has a palate that Charles and I have started to like. And that's what you look for in bottlers like this.
When I sit on my tongue and I breathe out, the corn is like right there.
Yeah.
Getting like heavy corn now. Yeah.
So who's a bourbon drinker now?
Oh, I have been.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know you're a bourbon
I like
drinker.
it all.
Yeah, this is
But
really
only
great.
some bourbon.
Yeah.
This is just like cold winter night sipping in front of the fireplace.
Yeah.
I've been to just the Kentucky.
Yeah, really nice.
And it's very cyclical. So whiskey is a lifelong sport and you're going to be in this for a long time. And so you kind of will ebb and flow, you know, peated might be what you really like now and you'll never dislike it, but you might start to like bourbon in 2 years, you know, you kind of go through these
And then you
phases.
get older, you go back to.
Yeah.
So
Back to the normal stuff.
But then it's like wine when you're a kid.
Right.
I'll tell
It
you,
makes-
a couple of drops of water really opens this up.
Yeah, try some
It's a
water.
little sweeter and you're getting more fruits.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
good.
I was like,
It's got that, some of that like cherry chapstick.
Cherry chapstick.
Sort of
What
vibe,
I was
the-
thinking was Luton's cherry.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think so. The coconut.
Yeah.
Emily says,
Yeah.
smells like Twizzlers.
Oh, yeah, I could see that
I
too.
can see that. Yeah. Cherry Twizzlers.
Rebecca says citrus.
So at risk of sounding naive, but I like it. You know, I just went on a ski trip to Smuggler's Notch and there's Smuggler's Notch Distilling Company now and they make a bourbon and I like it. But I don't know if it's a good bourbon or what, but
Well, that's all that
it's
matters
very
is that you like
drinkable.
it. Yeah.
It doesn't- but it's
There's so
also-
many bourbons now too.
Yeah.
It's really hard
But it
to
doesn't
almost
have
keep
like
track of.
the bite and the spice of this one. It was like a
Doesn't
lot
have to.
smoother.
It was probably
I
lower ABV. I'm thinking if I know the Smuggler's Notch whiskeys that I've had before, so definitely add water because this is barrel proof. So
Yeah, I added some, I like it better.
yeah, because they want you to feel like you're right in the warehouse, right in the rick house, you know,
Tasting.
with a thief, you know, actually tasting right out of the barrel, no water added. When you get something at 40%, 43, 46%, they added water for you before they put it in the bottle. So they want you to have 2 whiskeys in one with this. You can try it in the raw form of you're in the warehouse tasting it right out of the barrel, or you get to lower it down with
Like
water.
being
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rich.
You like the straw?
Yeah, I was gonna say, Vinny's right about the water with this. It really opens it up.
Yeah.
It deepens the flavor, rather than making it taste weaker. I think it really, deepens it.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just smell that one or rub it on my hands.
Yeah, everybody should try this with a couple of drops of water.
It made a difference.
You want to do Kings?
Rich was talking about how water really opened up the flavor,
Okay, yeah, that sounds.
like Vinny mentioned. You can do Kings. You know them better than me.
Yeah,
Okay.
I really like that.
So this will be a good one to try side by side with Maple Barrel Company. This is actually bought from that same
Hey,
MGP distillery.
you just step back just a tiny so that
Sure.
they can hear.
Same MGP distillery. Again, not a faux pas. It's nothing to, snuff at. Back in the day, about 10 years ago, there was a brand called, it was Templeton, right?
Yeah.
There was a brand that was trying to be a little bit deceitful of, they came up with this whole story of our distillery is, from the 1800s and we brought it back, and they made it you think that there was a physical distillery and that they made the whiskey, but they were buying it from other distilleries. There was no distillery. So in our eyes, it's always been, as long as you don't lie to me, I'm totally open to trying it, because you can, every barrel we've seen, every single barrel, and we've had quite a few tonight, they are all going to taste different. Some will be spicier, sweeter. Charles and I taste through single barrels all the time, and it's wild. They can be produced on the same day, same distillery, same distilling run, live side by side for years, and they taste completely different. Oak is so organic, and there's so much we still don't know about, evaporation and heat and temperature and humidity and slight location, rotation. I mean, they have a whole scientists and teams at these cooperages still trying to understand. I mean, obviously we have a much better grasp on it than when we thought it was, just a great oak container to put on a boat and go, across the ocean. We know more about it, but it still is good for that. So this is a small batch. Kings is actually, they do make some of their own whiskey. It doesn't make it to New York, but they are in the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. And I was down in the Smoky Mountains and visited them about.
I don't know if they can hear.
Yes.
This
Sorry,
is
but
the
this one
background.
apparently
Okay.
is very long conversation.
Sorry, we have to be quiet for the online folks. They can't hear, but we will discuss it in full, I promise, once, because I'm almost done rambling and then we'll be done. So King's family, Smoky Mountains, they just have the best access to barrels, and let me explain why. The wife, it's a husband-wife duo. I went down there. The wife is from Michigan, and she is part of a big grain farming family. So her family has been selling the rye grain to these big distilleries like Buffalo Trace and Brown-Forman and Sazerac, all these for decades. So she knows all of them. So A, she knows some people. B, her husband was the head distiller for Moonshine. It's an actual brand. It's not something that we drink, but it's still a big brand. So a distiller, and then he became the head of sales for MGP, the Midwest Grain Products. So he gets first, I mean, he doesn't say this, but you just know, he gets first pick of anything that he wants. And you can just tell they have good palates. They've been in the industry for a long time. This is a 95% rye, so very high rye spice. 95% rye, 5% malted barley, which is kind of the classic American rye right now, although that's changing. And they call this twice barreled. So it lived and was put in into new charred American oak, like it needed to be, because also rye whiskey, American whiskey needs to go into new American oak. It was put into new charred American oak, taken out and put back into a new charred American oak barrel. So it got a fresh new oak barrel twice. So that's called twice barreled. Some people call it double oaked. but it's really amping up that heavy, sweet toast oak
Very
influence.
spoiled.
Mhm.
I mean, real
You
good
said that it's
treatment.
changing like the 95.5. You know what, or is it like?
People are just starting to actually make mash bills and recipes with other grains like we see with bourbon. So you're seeing to be rye whiskey, similar to the rules of bourbon, where bourbon is really talking about a corn designation. Rye whiskey has to be at least 51% rye. And then you can do whatever else you want with it, but most of what we've been drinking has been 95% rye. A lot of, actually Kings, we just got one into the shop, has a 51%, so barely legal, 51% rye, the rest is corn and malted barley. So
That should be
you're
the name of
seeing
the
more
brand.
corn.
Sorry, that should be the name of the brand, barely legal.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know, that would be great.
What's the ABV on this?
Oh, yeah, so the ABV on this one, this is 6 years old as well, so same age as the bourbon. 6 years, 9 months, so a little bit older, 54.2% ABV, so it is natural cask strength again. So feel free to add some water.
This is totally rye. I mean, palate wise, it's like rye. They got the right name, Ryeconic. I mean, you
Yeah.
know it's a rye.
Mhm.
But I'll tell you, adding that 5% malted barley and no
Yeah,
corn, it
smooth,
really
95%.
smooths out that spiciness of the rye because it's not that spicy. I think
it's the double barrel.
Yeah,
So
it
it's
could be
that
the double
second
barrel.
maturation.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
That's really, because
It's
some
better.
ryes can be, a lot of people don't like rye still because it's that pepper kind of flame.
I always felt ryes were very harsh,
Mhm.
and not that I've drunk a
Some
lot,
are.
because I've had some experience, I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
that's not my booze.
Right.
But I try to maintain an open mind. I mean, this definitely tastes better than any rye I've ever had.
Yeah. And I think it's just a better quality selection in marriage, but I think that extra maturation
It's a
is
mellow
really
rye.
pushing some of that.
So how does something like
thickness.
Bullet get to be so popular? Because I think it doesn't taste that great at all.
It's actually the same mash bill. It's 95.5. You know, I think it's kind of, it's a solid whiskey. It's right place, right time. You know, rye was just starting to kind of come back as Bullet came onto the scene.
Right.
You know, it's becoming more popular.
They
Yeah,
had
I mean,
great
it's
marketing.
right
Yeah.
place, right time, and it is a solid, you know, bartenders like it. It's mixable, it's neat, you know, it's versatile. Where something like this, you know, you could of course make a
What's the price
cocktail, but
difference? Bullet's the right price, a really good price.
yeah, so this Glenlossie is $99.99. This will give you, Scallywag is $97.99. Raasay is $72.99. The High and Wicked is $94.99. Let's see how my number keeps going. The New England Barrel Co. is
70 something.
70 something 99. And the Ryeconic is 67.99. So that gives you
So
a
a little
rough
more than
idea.
a Bullet, but.
Yeah, because it's cask strength, much smaller batch,
This
has the
for
double barrel.
$67. I mean, this I would definitely.
They have a thrice
I love
barrel
it.
too, so
Wow.
3 times it went into then a toasted, so just a lightly
Oh,
toasted,
wow.
not charred. That is really amazing. as
That's
well.
gotta.
Yeah, what is?
Do you have that one too?
We did,
Oh,
we're hopefully getting it back.
But this one I would definitely want on my shelf, and this one, the $67.99, this would make a hell of a.
Kings has become one of the brands that I just trust what they do. I just trust everything that they do.
Rye can have-
So,
Normally I'll use Rittenhouse rye, which for me
Yeah.
is perfect,
Yeah, it's good.
but this one would make a massively good.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. That would be a special Manhattan.
No,
Yeah.
I'm a bourbon girl with my Manhattans. When I hear people say they're making a Manhattan rye.
Yeah, the question, the Old Overhaul is great, and that's been a bartender's choice for a long time. It's a rye. Yeah, it's a little bit thicker, it's like Old Overhaul is.
Please, Holly, it's Old Overcoat. Come on.
Whoops, sorry about that, Peter.
Right down the middle.
That's my house rye for mixing.
Old Overhaul, yeah. All right, was that a good?
Rich, the 86 or the 100 proof?
The 100.
Like, why do you do these on top? I know for if they're sitting around for a long time. but-
Yeah, I mean, the cast strength ones would probably be fine.
Right.
But you know, the 46, 48, you know, you wanna see it kind of right as it is out of the bottle and then let it breathe a little bit. Just to, because Charles filled these a
Because
little
when
while
we,
ago.
when we do our others, we like to let it sit for
Yeah.
30 minutes.
Yeah,
And definitely
To
that will change the
air.
whiskey, yeah.
yeah.
Right.
All right, guys, we're gonna stop the recording. But if you're on Zoom, thank you for joining, and we'll see you soon. But I hope you enjoyed it. and-
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, it was great.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks, Charles.
This was.
Thank you all the new people who showed up tonight.
Now you can talk